Sertaaj Speculation. Hi human, today our topic is nebula. A nebula is a giant cloud of dust and gas in space. Some nebulae, more than one nebula, come from the gas and dust thrown out by the explosion of a dying star, such as a supernova. Other nebulae are regions where new stars are beginning to form. For this reason, some nebulae are called star nurseries. Nebulae exist in the space between the stars, also known as interstellar space. The closest known nebula to Earth is called the Helix Nebula. It is the remnant of a dying star, possibly one like the Sun. It is approximately 700 light-years away from Earth. That means even if you could travel at the speed of light, it would still take you 700 years to get there. A planetary nebula is a type of emission nebula consisting of an expanding, glowing shell of ionized gas ejected from red giant stars late in their lives. The term planetary nebula is a misnomer because they are unrelated to planets. Dark nebula. A dark nebula or absorption nebula is a type of interstellar cloud, particularly molecular clouds, that is so dense that it obscures the visible wavelengths of light from objects behind it, such as background stars and emission or reflection nebulae. Crab nebula. The Crab Nebula is a supernova remnant and pulsar wind nebula in the constellation of Taurus. The common name comes from William Parsons, 3rd Earl of Ross, who observed the object in 1842 using a 36-inch telescope and produced a drawing that looked somewhat like a crab. Carina Nebula. The Carina Nebula or Eta Carini Nebula is a large, complex area of bright and dark nebulosity in the constellation Carina, located in the Carina, Sagittarius arm of the Milky Way galaxy. The nebula is approximately 8,500 light-years from Earth. Trifid Nebula. The Trifid Nebula is an H2 region in the northwest of Sagittarius in a star-forming region in the Milky Way's Scutum Centaurus arm. It was discovered by Charles Messier on June 5, 1764. Its name means three-lobe. Lagoon Nebula. The Lagoon Nebula is a giant interstellar cloud in the constellation Sagittarius. It is classified as an emission nebula and as an H2 region. The Lagoon Nebula was discovered by Giovanni Hodierna before 1654 and is one of only two star-forming nebulae faintly visible to the eye from mid-northern latitude. North America Nebula. The North America Nebula is an emission nebula in the constellation Cygnus, close to Deneb. It is named because its shape resembles North America. Butterfly Nebula. NGC 6302 is a bipolar planetary nebula in the constellation Scorpius. The structure in the nebula is among the most complex ever observed in planetary nebulae. Orion Nebula. The Orion Nebula is a diffuse nebula situated in the Milky Way, being south of Orion's belt in the constellation of Orion, and is known as the middle star in the Sword of Orion. It is one of the brightest nebulae and is visible to the naked eye in the night sky with apparent magnitude 4.0. Emission Nebula. An emission nebula is a nebula formed of ionized gases that emit light of various wavelengths. The most common source of ionization is high-energy ultraviolet photons emitted from a nearby hot star. Horsehead Nebula. The Horsehead Nebula is a small dark nebula in the constellation Orion. The nebula is located just to the south of Alnitak, the easternmost star of Orion's belt, and is part of the much larger Orion molecular cloud complex. Ring Nebula. The Ring Nebula is a planetary nebula in the northern constellation of Lyra. Such a nebula is formed when a star, during the last stages of its evolution before becoming a white dwarf, expels a vast luminous envelope of ionized gas into the surrounding interstellar space. Rosette Nebula. The Rosette Nebula is an H2 region located near one end of a giant molecular cloud in the Monoceros region of the Milky Way galaxy. The open cluster NGC 2244 is closely associated with the nebulosity, the stars of the cluster having been formed from the nebula's matter. Cat's Eye Nebula. The Cat's Eye Nebula is a planetary nebula in the northern constellation of Draco, discovered by William Herschel on February 15, 1786. Veil Nebula. The Veil Nebula is a cloud of heated and ionized gas and dust in the constellation Cygnus. It constitutes the visible portions of the Cygnus loop, a supernova remnant, many portions of which have acquired their own individual names and catalog identifiers. Omega Nebula. The Omega Nebula, also known as the Swan Nebula, Checkmark Nebula, Lobster Nebula, and the Horseshoe Nebula, is an H2 region in the constellation Sagittarius. Charles Messier catalogued it in 1764. Helix Nebula. The Helix Nebula is a planetary nebula located in the constellation Aquarius. Discovered by Carl Ludwig Harding, most likely before 1824, this object is one of the closest of all the bright planetary nebulae to Earth. Reflection Nebula. In astronomy, reflection nebula are clouds of interstellar dust which might reflect the light of a nearby star or stars. The energy from the nearby stars is insufficient to ionize the gas of the nebula to create an emission nebula, but is enough to give sufficient scattering to make the dust visible. Eagle Nebula. The Eagle Nebula is a young open cluster of stars in the constellation Serpens, discovered by Jean-Philippe de Chessos in 1745–46. Dumbbell Nebula. The Dumbbell Nebula is a planetary nebula in the constellation Vulpecula, at a distance of about 1360 light-years. Supernova Nebula. A supernova remnant is the structure resulting from the explosion of a star in a supernova. The supernova remnant is bounded by an expanding shock wave, and consists of ejected material expanding from the explosion, and the interstellar material it sweeps up and shocks along the way. Crescent Nebula. The Crescent Nebula is an emission nebula in the constellation Cygnus, about 5,000 light-years away from Earth. It was discovered by William Herschel in 1792. Bubble Nebula. NGC 7635, also known as the Bubble Nebula, Sharpless 162, or Caldwell 11, is an H2 region emission nebula in the constellation Cassiopeia. It lies close to the direction of the open cluster Messier 52. The bubble is created by the stellar wind from a massive hot, 8.7 magnitude young central star, SAO 20575. Tarantula Nebula. The Tarantula Nebula is a large H2 region in the Large Magellanic Cloud, forming its southeast corner. Thanks a million for watching all Sertaaj Speculation.